Hello, this is my co-presenter, Alice.
And this is my co-presenter, Robert John Langdon.
And this is Bob and Alice Debunks another video.
2,500 years ago, ancient Greeks told of a terrifying catastrophe. The destruction of Atlantis. It was a tale of utter devastation and carnage, and it's captivated the world for over 2,000 years. Atlantis, a once glittering city that had ruled the waves, now sunk beneath them, obliterated from the face of the earth by a terrible natural disaster. Atlantis was described as one of the greatest places on earth. Luxurious, rich and powerful. But for centuries, people have wondered, was it just a story? Or did such an amazing city ever exist before it sunk beneath the waves?
So did Plato describe Atlantis as the greatest place on earth? Luxurious, rich, and powerful?
No, I'm afraid, Alex, Plato never said all that. It's a load of old nonsense. And this is what we get in the 21st century. We don't get the true story of Plato's Atlantis. We get a new Hollywood version, which is a load of old nonsense, and people get the wrong idea about Atlantis. So what we'll do today, we're going to stop this video every time they talk nonsense, and we'll actually give you the real version from Plato rather than the Hollywood 21st century version, and that way you'll get a better idea exactly what Atlantis was and was not, and you'll even find out where it was actually situated, which you won't do on this program.
Now I'm on a journey through Greece to find out if there's any fact buried amongst the fiction. From clues hidden at the tops of mysterious mountains to discoveries buried deep beneath the ground, I'll trace the extraordinary story of the search for this legendary world. He wants this to be Atlantis.
He really wants this to be Atlantis.
Exploring today's incredible hunt for the ancient lost city.
I was determined to find it.
I'll uncover a world of luxury and beauty and evidence of brutal destruction. And I'll dive beneath the waves to find remains of an ancient city buried beneath the seas. Incredible archaeological discoveries, extraordinary detective work. This is the hunt for the real lost city of Atlantis.
So, why did you stop the video here, Bob? Looked like Dan was going to take us for a lovely tour of the picturesque Mediterranean.
Yes, Alice, Dan is going to go all the way around the Mediterranean, showing some very picturesque scenes, go diving under the water. There's only one problem with all this, is that Atlantis has nothing to do with the Mediterranean. Sadly, the most fundamental principle about Atlantis is missed and not even discussed in this documentary. One would imagine, why would you do this? Why would you not actually look at the basic principles of why is it called Atlantis in the first place? Is there anything that connects Atlantis today? We can actually see a connection. But this program goes into a complete flight of fantasy and nonsense from the first moment. So, what we're going to do is just take a look, and I won't even look. I've actually asked my friend called AI. AI is the most intelligent engine in the entire world. It has the collective knowledge of everything. And you can do things with AI which you can't do with professors who only have a limited knowledge of a few hundred books, why AI has accessed every single book that was ever published. So there is a big difference between AI and a professor. And I've asked it a very simple question about the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the Atlantic Ocean should, to me, be an obvious connection because of the spelling. But no one talks about the Atlantic Ocean on these programs, which is painful, really, when you come to look at the writings of Plato. Furthermore, the second aspect, which will not be discussed in this program, is that he actually tells you where Atlantis is, which really helps, doesn't it? It really helps when someone says, hey guys, if you actually read and understand and comprehend the words on the page in front of me, I will tell you exactly where Atlantis is. And it's beyond the Pillars of Hercules, because the Mediterranean's inside or behind the Pillars of Hercules. So when you're looking in the Mediterranean, Dan, you're in the entire wrong place. Because if you ever bother to read Plato's The Basics, he will tell you this. But the incredible aspect of it is that there is something beyond the Pillars of Hercules as we exit from the Mediterranean, and it's called the Atlantic Ocean. Now, one would say, oh, is that a clue? Bob, Bob, is that a clue that something is called the Atlantic Ocean? And if we transpose the C and the S, suddenly there's an association. This is what AI tells us about this association. And it says, remember, this is the most comprehensive and most intelligent thing on the planet. It says, yes, there is a connection between the word Atlantic and Atlantis. Lo and behold. The name Atlantis comes from the Greek Atlantis Nessos, which means the island of Atlas. In Greek mythology, Atlas is a titan condemned to hold up the sky for eternity, and his name was later associated with the Atlantic Ocean, reflecting the extent of the ocean's span, which seems to be as vast as the burden which Atlas had to bear. So, we have this direct connection in Greek mythology between Atlantis and Atlantic. The term Atlantic Ocean itself is derived from Atlantikos, pertaining to Atlas. The legend of Atlantis, as recounted by Plato, places the island in the Atlantic Ocean, which is said to have been named after the Titan Atlantis. The story suggests that Atlantis was situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is known today as the Straits of Gibraltar, the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. According to the myth, when Atlantis sank, it supposedly made parts of the Atlantic impassable, further trying the myth of the island to the name of the ocean. Thus, both the ocean and the mythical island derive their names from Titan Atlas, creating a linguistic connection between them. So, AI says there's a direct connection between the Atlantic Ocean and Atlantis.
I love being in Greece. I love the landscape, the rugged mountains, and then the beautiful coastline and the sea. I love the fact there's so many historic sites to visit here. It's a place of magic, a place of mystery. And really, there's no bigger mystery than the strange ancient Greek story of the city of Atlantis, which lies underneath the waves. It seems very unlikely, and yet I'm off to visit a place now where I've been told that's exactly what I'm going to see. The first destination on my hunt for Atlantis is Pavlopetri, an isolated spot on the barren southernmost tip of mainland Greece, where the ancient fragments of a destroyed lost city lie beneath the waves, like the legendary Atlantis. There is an air of mystery surrounding this beautiful stretch of coastline. The rocky shore is covered with strange crater-like pits where human bones have been discovered. The waves lap against huge stone blocks that look man-made. But for thousands of years, no one had really investigated what was going on here. Until a British archaeologist, Nicholas Fleming, arrived at Pavlopetri hunting for sunken sites.
Just like today, the beach was scattered with shards of ancient pottery. You can see these two bits here. Actually, this is a much better piece. Look, it's like the rim of a drinking vessel or a storage container. And you could tell that this pottery had all been rubbed very smooth by the actions of the waves. It had probably been washed ashore from somewhere just out there. So he put on his scuba gear and went swimming. And instantly, he started to see wonderful things.
Over the next year, he would uncover a submerged ancient city. Had he found Atlantis? These waters can get quite rough, churning up the sand and burying everything. So I'm really hoping that some of what Fleming saw back in 1967 is still visible. Luckily, I've got local diver George to guide me, and he knows this seabed like the back of his hand.
Okay, here goes. Let's go and see what's beneath the waves.
The sea is fairly shallow here, so I don't have to dive too deep to explore.
It's amazing. The water is beautifully clear. And at first you're looking at shells or bits of rock. Then you swim a bit closer and you realise these are shards of broken pottery from thousands of years ago.
Although the water's clear, years of rough seas have buried what Fleming saw back in the 60s, and you have to look carefully to see any remains. But when you do get your eye in, you can see straight lines in the rocks.
Those rocks are far too neatly aligned, they're far too straight to be put there by nature.
They look like a wall, and George tells me that this was once the wall of someone's house. Shifting sands have covered the rest, but I'm swimming over the foundations of an entire neighborhood here. By scanning the seabed, archaeologists have been able to piece together the remains of the city and a sense of its layout. You can make out rectangular shapes which they identified as buildings and courtyards. There are rows upon rows of them spreading across this sea floor. And there's not only the homes of the living, but the graves of the dead. They stretch all the way from the beach to under the water.
It looks like these holes. These, I think, this must be the cemetery. These must be graves. Well, I've visited ancient sites all over the world. I've been high in the mountains. I've been in deep jungles, but I have never dived on an ancient site beneath the waves.
Marine archaeologists now think that Pavlopetri vanished 3,500 years ago. A century before the famous pharaoh Tutankhamun ruled Egypt. It's thought that it was hit by an earthquake and then submerged under the sea as the waters rose. A real echo of the Atlantis story, the legendary lost city beneath the sea.
Unless you know what's beneath the waves here, this just feels like a lovely remote beach, a beautiful spot. But in fact, down there is the remains of a thriving, a bustling ancient city. The buildings would have been up to 2 stories high, packed together. They would have been trading with the Aegean islands round into the Ionian. This was a busy, dynamic place of life. But now all that's left are a few foundations beneath the waves and the graves of their dead.
So could this really be a match for the spectacular city and the events described in the Atlantis story? Well, I think it's a possibility. But this is a region plagued by earthquakes and volcanoes. So now my hunt for Atlantis is taking me to where the story began. Athens, home to some of the greatest ancient monuments and archaeological treasures in the world. 2,500 years ago, it was here that one of its most famous residents first told the incredible story of Atlantis. I've come to one of his favourite hangouts, the Agora. Back then, the central meeting place in Athens.
This place would have been a hive of activity. People coming here to shop, to chat, to gossip, day and night. Anyone who was anyone. Beggars, tradesmen and politicians. And of course, philosophers. And the most famous of them was Plato, the man who first tells us about Atlantis and how it was destroyed.
To discover the real inspiration behind Atlantis, I need to get to the bottom of exactly what Plato wrote.
All right, come on then. The big question. Atlantis, fact or fiction?
You had to start with the hardest
Yes.
question, didn't you?
Let's get into it.
Jasmine Elmer is an expert on ancient Greece.
I would say it's definitely a story, but with little reality sprinkles on top.
Hang on, that sounds a bit philosophical to me. There wasn't actually a city called Atlantis.
No, there's no real city called Atlantis. It's a mythical place that's made up by the philosopher Plato.
But I can go looking for the places that might have inspired Plato.
Yeah, totally right. What you will find is potentially these kind of places that have a similar story about them that could have inspired the story of Atlantis.
And so how does he describe it?
Well, he talks about it being this kind of huge island that's out in the Atlantic Ocean, which to Greeks is this kind of like vague space somewhere over there. But it's absolutely huge.
Is it kind of a flourishing civilization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, it's a land rich in resources. So they had their own minerals and metals that they could mine. They had fertile plains, so they could like grow loads of amazing fruit and vegetables. They had exotic animals, like even like elephants. They also imported a lot of goods as well, so they had lots of luxury around them. Colourful temples and palaces as well. Essentially, what the Greeks would perceive as a very advanced civilization.
So it's a sort of idealised picture of a society.
Completely that, exactly that. It's like a almost utopian society. Everything kind of seems on the surface as being a perfect place that you'd want to live.
To begin with, the picture Plato paints of Atlantis is idyllic. A sprawling, prosperous city surrounded by olive trees. A busy port filled with ships. Magnificent squares and luxurious bathhouses. But it doesn't stay that way for long. In the story, this perfect city is hit by a cataclysmic earthquake before a terrifying tsunami buries it beneath the waves. And Plato had a moral to his tale.
It's obviously a natural disaster, but it comes from the gods as a punishment for being too big for your boots, for trying to expand and be greedy. The Atlanteans decide that they want to expand their empire and take over, and they actually want to invade Athens as well. And that's a big no-no for Plato. So the message is, if you are an advanced civilization and it's all hunky-dory and great, don't get too big for your boots, because bad things can happen to you, like what happens at Atlantis.
And Plato was living in a society where the earth does move quite a lot.
Exactly. I mean, this is what the reality sprinkles was I mentioned earlier on, because absolutely the Greeks are living in a world where natural disasters are occurring. That's where you get this kind of modern idea that Atlantis is this submerged city that we might be able to find.
Because it's interesting, I've just been to Pavlopetri, so there are places around Greece that they would have known about which are underwater.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's an amazing site, fantastic, like beautiful, and so much you can take from it. Could it have influenced Plato? It's possible, but it kind of happened around 1,000 years before Plato. So would Plato know about it? Maybe. But there are definitely these sorts of things happening over Greece that definitely could have inspired Plato in his storytelling.
I'm going to rule out Pavla Petri as a candidate for Atlantis. From what I saw, it doesn't feel grand enough for tales of its destruction to have survived 1,000 years. I need a new lead, a place that sounds more believable, more spectacular.
About 150 years ago, there was a breakthrough archaeological discovery at a place that I think might fit the bill. A place on Greece's largest island, to the south of here.
99 miles from Athens, across the Aegean Sea, that island is Crete. And the extraordinary discovery, made here late in the 19th century, changed everything. Suddenly, people began to wonder if Crete could have been the inspiration for Atlantis. Like Plato's island, it's massive, covering over 3,000 square miles. And in Plato's time, it was the setting for many epic tales.
In 1877, a man who was brilliantly called Minos, after the legendary king who once ruled over this island, discovered some strange, large stone blocks just down there in a place called Knossos. Not much was made of it at the time because the island was embroiled in a bitter war, but word of it did get out.
And 20 years later, a famous British archaeologist arrived in Crete. He was on a mission to investigate the mysterious finds. His name was Arthur Evans. Evans spent 6 years negotiating and haggling to gain permission to investigate the site. Finally, in March 1900, with an army of 30 men, he began to dig. There was no more time to waste.
Almost at once, their efforts were rewarded. As they shoveled away mountains of dirt from this section here, they revealed these huge stone blocks which seemed to be forming a corridor.
This was the first glimpse that something monumental really lay beneath their feet. A possible Atlantis. With mounting anticipation, they carried on digging. And then, just 3 weeks later, on the 5th of April 1900, Evans came face to face with something incredible.
Early that morning, the team were clearing some dirt off one of the standing walls, and they started to see what looked like an image painted beneath. It was damaged, but soon features were visible. It was a human. It was life-size, with rich red skin, slim waist, eyes shaped almost like almonds, and it was holding a cup. Nothing like this had been seen before. Evans guessed that it was ancient. In fact, no one had looked into those eyes for 3,500 years.
This amazing discovery was the first glimpse that an ancient civilization lay lost and buried here, just like Atlantis. It was the start of a rapid succession of spectacular find after find. Painted corridors, rooms full of magnificent jars, and grand staircases. And then, on April the 13th, after 8 more days of frenzied, back-breaking digging, the team worked their way to this spot. Evans was about to uncover the most remarkable, game-changing discovery of his life.
At first, it wasn't clear what he'd found. It was a finely crafted room, and there was evidence of beautiful paintings on these walls. There were benches along the edges. Then there were steps leading down to this strange sunken pit that reminded Evans of a communal bathhouse that you might find in a Roman site. But then he made an astonishing discovery. Just opposite the pit, there was a beautifully crafted chair. In Evans's mind, suddenly, this was not a bathroom, this was a throne room, the heart of some ancient royal palace.
Gradually, an incredible lost world was coming back to life before their eyes. News of the remarkable discoveries captivated the world. With evidence of a royal throne room, Evans was certain he'd found the palace of King Minos, the legendary ancient king of Crete. The archaeologist named the civilization Minoan after the king. But some people began to make another connection. Could this lost world actually be the inspiration for Atlantis, the magnificent island city that had been devastated in Plato's story?
There are some very interesting parallels between this place and Plato's Atlantis. First of all, Knossos is on a huge, lush island. That's a big tick. And then Plato describes a royal palace that befitted the greatness of the kingdom. It was made up from buildings of many colours by blending the stones for the sake of ornament. Well, that could be describing this palace. He also describes how sacred bulls were allowed to roam free through the palace at Atlantis. And there's one thing you see plenty of here, and that's images of bulls.
As Evans excavated, he discovered images of bulls throughout the site. Even wall paintings of Minoan people leaping over the back of charging bulls. And this was just the beginning. As Evans and his team excavated over 14,000 square meters, the parallels between Knossos and Plato's story of Atlantis seemed to grow and grow. Plato described that the size and beauty of Atlantis was astonishing to see. Just like the enormous complex of grand buildings here. In Plato's story, the royal citadel in Atlantis is surrounded by mighty mountains, just like Knossos. And as local expert Akrivi Katsigeorgiou is showing me, there was even more tantalizing evidence of the similarities. The gods of Atlantis were also present here.
I would like to show you something which is very interesting. Look at here.
What have we got here? That's like a trident.
Was the symbol of Poseidon. It was used as an arrow, as a symbol, showing which way to go.
Okay, so like a signpost.
Yeah.
Oh, let's follow it.
Come on, let's go.
According to Plato, Poseidon was the main god on Atlantis. He ruled the waves and made Atlantis a mighty sea power. Plato tells us that its vast harbour was crowded with merchant ships, and there was a constant din of noise and shouting day and night. In the heart of Knossos, a magnificent building shows that the Minoans also dominated the seas.
This is the grand staircase, one of the miracles of the Minoan architecture.
Oh, that is magnificent. It's huge.
Yes, this is the big staircase, the grand staircase. They made a deep cut to this side of the hill in order to be able to construct 2 floors lower than this level where we are. It was a big warehouse, a big economic center.
So it's a place of trade.
Exactly. Goods from all over the Eastern Mediterranean Sea came in this building from Egypt. They imported cotton, wheat. Copper was imported from the island of Cyprus. The Greek name Kypros means copper, the island of copper.
Wow.
Also elephant tusks. We found whole elephant tusks.
Elephant tusks.
They are at the museum, as well as gold from Nubia, where the mines of the Egyptian Empire.
So North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean,
exactly.
Southern Europe, all coming here.
Yeah, exactly. This was the crossroad.
The Minoans clearly had a vast trade network, just like the Atlanteans from Plato's story. And like Atlantis, the archaeologists also began to realize this was a huge place. They estimated that between 25 and 30,000 people lived here. And by delving into Knossos' magnificent buildings, it also became clear these people lived a life of luxury, just like the inhabitants of Atlantis.
We know from the discoveries is that the upper classes loved beautiful things. Women were dressed with elaborated garments. Jewelry was worn by both men as well as women. They loved wine, they loved good food.
So lots of fish from the sea.
Exactly, we found seafood, shells, we found fishing hooks, so they loved seafood.
So if you had wealth, it was a good place to live.
Exactly.
So this was a rich, luxurious place. There was magnificent buildings here, it was powerful. It sounds so similar to the way that Plato writes about Atlantis.
The discoveries at Knossos had put Crete on the map, and they'd also made Atlantis a hot topic. On February the 15th, 1909, an anonymous article was published in the Times.
The title was simply Atlantis, and it gives all sorts of detail about the excavations here in Crete and the Atlantis story, and draws a direct connection between them. It says, if the account of Atlantis is to be compared with the history of Crete, it seems almost certain that here we have an echo of the Minoans. And the Times said this may very well engage the serious attention of scholars and archaeologists. And it was absolutely right.
Crete was now firmly in the spotlight to prove that this really was the inspiration for the legendary lost city of Atlantis.
You can see why people thought they were walking through Atlantis. There's a tickle of a sea breeze coming off the ocean. You can see the mountains over there in the background, and everything seems to grow here. It's just so abundant. Plato describes Atlantis like this. He said that it produced and brought to perfection all those sweet scented stuffs which the earth produces now. Roots, herbs, trees, fruit, vegetables, all these, that hallowed island as it lay beneath the sun, produced in marvellous beauty and endless abundance. Reads a bit like a guidebook to Crete.
In his story of Atlantis, Plato tells us that vineyards and olive groves flourished, producing olive oil and wine for the enjoyment of its people. Today, Crete is also a thriving olive oil and wine producer. And there's evidence that it's been this way for thousands of years. This isolated little chapel is only around 100 years old, but it's built on the foundations of something far older.
This is a remarkable and ancient wine press. And the fields around here are still covered in vineyards to this day, and so they've been pressing wine up here for generations. It's unclear exactly how old this is. Some people locally think it is Minoan. That means the same era as the palace at Knossos. But the winemaking process is pretty straightforward. You bring your grapes in here, and people with nice clean feet press the grapes, stand on top of them, jump on top of them, and all of that liquid flows out into the surrounding tubs through this hole here, for example. And then that grape juice comes pouring out in a huge torrent from here into this tub, ready to be turned into wine.
Crete is believed to be the birthplace of Greek wine production, made here on the island for around 5,500 years. I'm visiting one of the region's modern vineyards to find out more about Crete's wine-producing heritage and why it links this island to the Atlantis story.
Let's start from the harvest. The harvest here in Crete starts about August to September. It's by hand.
So you still pick the grapes with your hands? There's no machine?
Yeah, we still do it by hand with just scissors. Yeah.
And so that's a tradition that's been going on for thousands of years.
Maybe they have not scissors. Maybe they have another way to cut the grapes. But this is the same, because the landscape with the hills and the small properties, it's impossible to have harvest machines.
But of course, there are some parts of the winemaking process that have changed a little since the Minoans.
So here we have the press machines.
Now this is different to what would have been done in the past, because this was all humans doing this in the past, right?
Exactly the same idea, but no electricity, just food.
Footwork.
Just it.
I don't think you want my feet anywhere near wine. So I think this is a very good system.
Today, once the wine is pressed, it is stored in these vast stainless steel vats before it's bottled and shipped around the world. At Knossos, 3,500 years ago, they used enormous clay jars. And there's evidence they also exported it far and wide.
Minoans were great exporters. So from the ports, they went in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Israel, especially in these countries. We found a lot of paintings, especially in Egypt, paintings with the appearances of vineyards or jars or winemaking and wine life.
So Cretan wine is one of the big secrets of Minoan success. It's bringing them wealth through trade.
Exactly.
So they were making a lot of wine.
A lot of wine and brilliant wine.
Of course, the best. The more I learn about ancient Crete, with its magnificent architecture and its abundant fields producing all of nature's bounty, the more I think it really could be inspiration for Plato's Atlantis.
In his story, Plato tells us that Atlantis had close contact with Egypt, just like the ancient Minoans on Crete. This link was yet another detail mirroring the Atlantis story.
So, why did you stop the video here, Bob?
We've stopped here, Alice, at halfway because we need to do a small recap because we've seen lots of nonsense in the last half hour. The main items you should take into consideration is one, that Atlantis was not in the Mediterranean. We can see that very clearly from the writings. It actually stated that in the writings, but it's not being quoted or understood. This is both by archaeologists and by documentary makers because it's not good telly. And for archaeologists, they've got nothing to see because they don't really understand the location of Atlantis. Then they sell books about the Mediterranean because it's easy. It's not right. It's not good science. It's just media garbage, sadly. Now, if you actually look at the sites they're seeing, you can see it becomes very, very clear that they're looking at sites about 3,500 years old. Well, that's 6,000 years after Plato stated that Atlantis sunk or started to sink. It's not even close when it comes to historical timelines. The second aspect, and which confuses them all and drives me completely bonkers when I watch these sort of programs, is the size of Atlantis. Atlantis is huge. It's vast. It's not a small island. The city is probably bigger than most of the small islands. Unless Plato is making it all up, then the proportions are completely wrong. And if he was making it up, if it was a story, a political story, as they keep trying to allude to, why make the dimensions of this place enormous? Why don't they have reasonable dimensions which would fit a small island like Crete? The other thing that doesn't make sense is that Plato actually wrote a political book about an ideal society, and it's called Plato's Republic. Now, if you want to put a message in that society they're in is wrong, then you put that message into Plato's Republic, and he did. So why talk about Atlantis? Atlantis was written after Plato's Republic. Now, if there's a political message there which academics seem to be convinced about, why didn't you put it into Plato's Republic? It was a book about politics, for goodness sake. It's a complete nonsense. So what we got here is we're looking at islands which are far too small. Atlantis is the size of Libya and Asia combined. Now, the Asia that Greeks knew at the time was Asia Minor, which is Turkey, basically. So Atlantis is the size of Turkey and Libya. They know Libya quite well. They traded with Libya. They know Libya is a very big, vast country. Plato understood the size of Libya and he understood the size of Asia Minor because they traded and knew about them well. So when he came to do the proportions, he would have in mind the right size. And he actually gives exact sizes of the island and the size of the city. And one of the aspects when he does do, he actually describes the city of Atlantis, which is concentric circles. None of the places that they went to are cities of concentric circles, but they don't talk about that. They take in very small parts of the book rather than the book as a whole and come up with a narrative. We're going to now continue on with this nonsense, and at the end I'll summarize and then tell you exactly where the island of Atlantis is. So stay tuned.
This link was yet another detail mirroring the Atlantis story. And as those parallels grew and grew, in the 1960s, one man became captivated. He would become one of history's greatest Atlantis hunters.
His name was Spiridon Marinatos. He was a local archaeologist and the curator of the museum in town. He became obsessed. He spent much of the rest of his career trying to prove that this Minoan civilization was the basis for Plato's Atlantis, a city that had been wiped off the map.
Marinatos had first visited Knossos while archaeologists excavated in the 1920s. He'd been blown away by their beautiful discoveries, but he'd also been fascinated by something else they'd unearthed.
As the team excavated the palace, they realised that it had been repaired, changed at various points in its lifetime. It had obviously been through quite a lot.
Like Atlantis, the Minoan civilization had vanished almost without trace for thousands of years. No one knew why. In the story, Atlantis had been the victim of a terrible natural disaster. But had a natural disaster also wiped out the civilization here? Marinatos was now on a mission to find out. His investigations have been studied by Minoan expert Steve Kershaw.
And what do you think happened here?
There's a palace here that's been inhabited for 450 years, going through all sorts of different phases of destruction and rebuilding and modification. And some of those destructive events were natural, the kind of things that earthquakes. Some of them may have been man-made as well.
And so some of that could just be accidental fire?
It could indeed, but Marinatos really wanted to get to the bottom of this, and he's found traces of volcanic dust on the island, so he thinks it's something volcanic. But he doesn't think that the volcano is on Crete. He thinks it's on a nearby island.
Marinatos wants to prove that a volcanic eruption from a nearby island had destroyed the Minoan civilization here. And he had a very specific island in mind, Santorini, which lies just 60 miles away. And it's home to an enormous volcano.
So is Marinatos looking for this volcano solution a little bit because of his obsession with the story of Atlantis?
It's very possible. He knows that story, he likes that story, and he, in a sense, wants that story to be true.
He wants this to be Atlantis.
He really wants this to be Atlantis.
But there's also another reason why Marinatos was fascinated by the possible link between Crete and nearby Santorini. And that's because in his story of Atlantis, Plato says that Atlantis wasn't just one island, but made up of several islands. He said that the royal centre was on Atlantis' main island, but the docks and harbour were on another. Could Santorini be one of the other islands mentioned in the story?
Marinatos was thrilled with this theory, and he thought if he could prove it, the link between the Minoans, Crete and Atlantis would be stronger than ever. Could it be that an enormous eruption out there on Santorini had inspired the story of Atlantis? In 1967, he set out on a hunt to find out.
Following Marinatos' search for Atlantis, I'm now heading to the island of Santorini, 60 miles away across the sea.
Santorini is home to the biggest and most volatile volcano in the region. If you look at these rock formations, this whole island is basically one enormous volcano.
Just 17 years before Marinatos arrived, Santorini's volcano had erupted, spewing ash and fireballs 1,000 meters into the sky. In just 6 days, 90 billion tons of molten rock was thrown into the air.
What if an even more violent eruption had occurred 3,500 years before, at the time when the Minoan civilization discovered on Crete reached its height? That could mean that there was a city buried here beneath the rock.
A busy city with docks and harbours. But where should Marinatos start his hunt for this lost port? There are 42 miles of coastline on this island. And that wasn't his only challenge.
It's a fairly daunting prospect because that mighty volcanic eruption had blasted millions of tons of volcanic debris into the sky that then fell, blanketing this island in layer upon layer of pumice and rock and volcanic ash. And you can see some of those layers etched out in this cliff face here. So that meant that if there were any ancient ruins here, the chances are they'd be under meters and meters of this stuff.
It must have seemed like mission impossible. But little did Marinatos know, on the coast of Santorini, he was about to make the greatest archaeological discovery of his life. The island of Santorini, 1967. The hunt was on to find out if a port city had been buried beneath the ground following a gigantic volcanic eruption 3,500 years ago. If they found it, it would help prove Spiridon Marinatos' theory that this island and neighbouring Crete could have been the inspiration for the story of Atlantis, where a whole series of islands had been obliterated by natural disaster. He was on a mission to investigate. And now he'd pinpointed an area to target. 70 years ago, an intriguing clue had been found buried near this spot under meters of ash.
In 1899, some labourers in a quarry just inland from here started finding some mysterious objects. They didn't know what they were, but they thought they looked ancient.
Marinatos was intrigued. This was the perfect position for a port city, right on the coast. So gathering together a team, he started to investigate here. He had no idea how deep they'd have to dig. The volcanic ash and rock is 30 meters high in some places on the island. But, remarkably, on the very first day, they made a breakthrough.
They were digging through stuff just like this here, and he was ecstatic when about 4 meters down he started to make out the shape of pots, and to his expert eye they were clearly storage jars, and storage jars that looked to be exactly the same type and date as the ones he was so familiar with from Knossos in Crete. But that was nothing, because just a few days later he would discover an entire buried city.
He called it Akrotiri.
Wow. And these are the pots, these are the storage jars that he discovered so early on as he started digging. And he didn't just discover one or two. Look, there were 3 rooms full of them. So different shapes and sizes, different designs on the outside, maybe just to look nice and pretty, but maybe to indicate that they were designed to store different foodstuffs, some olive oil, some perhaps wine. What a fantastic start to the excavation.
Over the next 7 years, the archaeologists feverishly excavated. Wall after wall, room after room, and building after building slowly began to appear from beneath the 3,500-year-old ash and rubble. And as they dug, they began to reveal striking similarities with the story of Atlantis. Located by the sea, it was almost certainly a port city. And just like Atlantis, there was evidence that its destruction had started with an earthquake.
This staircase here, look at that. Finely crafted, strongly built stairs, and yet they've just been snapped in half in an instant by the shockwave that the earthquake sent through this entire settlement. Little did the survivors know after that earthquake, as they tried to put their lives back in order, there was worse to come.
Like Atlantis, a once thriving city had been obliterated. Minoan expert Steve Kershaw is giving me a guided tour of the ruins to show me its past splendor.
Steve, I always love an archaeological site where you look up at this was a multi-storey city, wasn't it?
It was indeed. It's now buried beneath metres and metres of volcanic debris.
So it's all looking a bit grey now, but presumably would it have been whitewashed? Would it have been colourful insides and things?
It would indeed, yes. The exteriors would have been plastered over. On the inside, you've got colourful frescoes and what have you.
Amongst the devastation are also details showing the true horror that the people here experienced.
What on earth are these?
Yeah, a couple of beds, the imprints of beds. And what happened was, before the eruption, there was an enormous earthquake, and the people of the town were tidying it up.
So they were stacking the beds, trying to tidy the house up, maybe pick up loose bricks and things.
Very much so. And some of them are protecting bits of pottery as well. You've got a little tripod cooking pot down there. So this is the repair work on the town before the eruption that they never knew was coming. What's happened is that the wood has decayed in the volcanic material, and the archaeologists have poured plaster into it to recreate the bed out of the space.
So the archaeologists found a vacuum, they poured plaster in, it was a bed shape.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's a moment in time really captured from 3,500 years ago.
Very much so. It takes you right to the heart of people's real lives, and that's one of the wonderful things that archaeology can do for us, I think.
With its impressive multi-storey buildings, Akrotiri had clearly been wealthy, just like Atlantis. And as more and more of the ancient city surfaced from the ash, the similarities grew even stronger.
So what are we looking at here?
So this is one of the main streets of the town, and you've got houses on either side. You can just see the remains of the walls. Then a main street that would have been paved with beautiful flagstones. And then the most remarkable thing, I think, underneath it, you've got a drainage system.
Like that gutter there?
That gutter, yes, that humble gutter is actually a mark of extremely high civilization.
Amazing.
There's flushing lavatory systems, and that would have all gone into that and flushed it out into the sea.
I mean, that wasn't normal at the time, presumably.
No, that is highly sophisticated. There's not many cultures have got that level of water engineering in their states at this time. And these people have got it down so well.
And that, I guess, allows everyone to live together in this crowded way without getting terrible diseases.
It's going to help. One of the reasons that people have drawn parallels between here and Plato's Atlantis is precisely this facility with water engineering. Because the Atlanteans are kind of the ultimate water engineers. They create bathhouses with both cold and hot, not just for their elite classes, but for the rest of the population, and indeed not just for the human population, but for the horses, the beasts of burden, and the animals. So we have cleanliness pervading Atlantis.
So in Plato's Atlantis, even the animals are clean.
They are.
So for Plato and the ancient Greeks, water management, that said, you're an advanced civilization.
It does indeed, yeah.
And they're doing it here.
They're doing it right here.
Brilliant.
After digging up Akrotiri, Marinatos was now convinced that his theory was right. The combination of Knossos Palace on Crete and this port city was inspiration for Atlantis.
It was like Atlantis itself had been found in stone. You no longer had to imagine it. You could walk through the streets. You could almost sense the people that had once lived here.
Today, many of Akrotiri's finest treasures lie in Santorini's archaeological museum in the town of Thera. Each one gives a fascinating insight into that lost world and the parallels with the story of Atlantis.
I love these murals. This was painted onto the wall of one of the grandest houses in Akrotiri, and it's such a special thing to have an image of their world painted by the people who actually lived in it. Just look at this wonderful island here. It's lush. You've got fantastic detail. It's like trees, deer, perhaps a lion up there. And then, my favourite bit, this armada of ships and boats heading out across the sea. Some of them under oar, some of them sail-powered, some of them look ceremonial, like it's almost a kind of festival experience. Dolphins all around them, and they're arriving in somewhere that I think looks quite like Santorini. Barren, red cliffs, a sense of the volcanic with coloured buildings, people greeting them. This is a wealthy maritime world, a world of colour and vibrancy. Could this settlement at the end here actually be Akrotiri? Was this what it looked like before it was destroyed in that volcano? The other thing that really strikes me when you look at this, you look at the animals, the richness of the colours, the buildings, the ships. If you did want a picture of Plato's Atlantis, this is pretty much it.
Many of Akrotiri's buildings were covered with beautiful frescoes that incredibly survived the disaster. Each and every one seems to strengthen the connection with Atlantis. There are fishermen proudly holding their catch, linking the Minoans to the sea, just like the Atlanteans in the story. Like Atlantis and Crete, Akrotiri was clearly a rich and luxurious place. We can see that from their hairstyles, their fashions, their jewellery. There are exotic animals native to Africa. And in Atlantis, Plato mentions elephants.
The more I read about Atlantis, and the more I explore the wonderful archaeology on these islands, the more I get a real sense of why people got so excited about the apparent similarities between the Minoans and the story of Atlantis.
Marinatos had discovered that, like the Atlanteans who ruled over several islands, the real-life Minoans flourished both here and on Crete. The Minoans too were clearly a massive sea power with connections as far away as Egypt. And they suffered an epic natural disaster. The idea that these places were the inspiration for Plato's Atlantis is compelling.
The problem I have with it is it took place over 1,000 years before Plato was writing. And we've got absolutely no evidence that Plato had ever heard about it. In fact, there is no account, no mention of the destruction of Akrotiri in any ancient source at all. Possibly we've lost those sources over the years, and possibly it was such an enormous event that it was just talked about, handed down from parent to child over the generations.
So despite all the incredible similarities with Atlantis, I'm going to continue my search. And luckily, there is another contender. Through an incredible piece of detective work, Archaeologists have just discovered another lost city on the coast of mainland Greece. Perhaps the inspiration for Atlantis lies closer to Plato's home of Athens and much closer to Plato's time.
The archaeologists discovered that not only was this city destroyed, but that destruction was big news in Greece during Plato's lifetime. Could this city be the real Atlantis?
Are we not going to watch the programme to the very end?
No, Alice, we've seen enough, I think. For another half hour, Dan will walk around going to other sites in mainland Greece and suggest this could be the inspiration for Atlantis. It's quite interesting they use the word inspiration. Inspiration isn't proof or evidence. It just piggybacks on this strange belief that Plato made the whole thing up.
So, are you going to tell us where Atlantis really is, Bob?
Okay, Alice, I shall tell you. For any person to claim they know the location of Atlantis, they have to qualify it by answering 5 simple questions. Question 1. Is it in the Atlantic Ocean? Question 2. Is it bigger than Libya and Turkey? Question 3. Is it 9,000 years ago? Question 4. Did the landscape have elephants and tigers? And question 5. Was it an advanced civilization?
And do you have a particular site and location in mind then?
And the answer to that question, Alice, is Doggerland.
So, does Doggerland meet these 5 criterias?
Doggerland was an ancient landmass that is currently under the North Sea.
I can't imagine that, Bob. How do you know it's there?
Well, Alice, now that takes a lot of imagination, but it's absolutely true. No one believed it until the middle part of last century, when we sonared the seabed looking for oil. And as well as finding oil, we found Doggerland.
So, why do academics still believe Atlantis is in the Mediterranean?
And this is where we get these strange ideas about Atlantis being in the Mediterranean, because the historians at the time of the 20th century had no idea that there was a civilization and a landmass under the North Sea. So they thought that Plato made it all up, which clearly he did.
So, does Doggerland meet all your criteria, Bob?
Doggerland qualifies on all 5 points. It is in the Atlantic Ocean because Doggerland would incorporate all of what we call Great Britain in the past. 10,000 years ago, the sea levels were much, much lower, and therefore the North Sea, the Irish Sea, and the English Channel did not exist. It was one large peninsula in the Atlantic Ocean. The combined landscape of Great Britain and Europe is actually larger than Libya and Asia Minor. It had massive flat plains and mountains as described by Plato. We also, in Northern Europe, have things called causeway camps. Causeway camps are concentric circle settlements, as described again by Plato. Doggerland began to sink into the waters 9,500 years ago. It became a small island before it finally vanished under the water some 6,000 years ago, which again matches Plato's timeline. For nearly 100 years, The fishing trawlers have been collecting bones from animals off the seabed of Doggerland. Now, these bones include, would you believe, elephants, mammoths, lions, tigers, bears, all manner of animals which we don't see in the northern hemisphere today. And the icing on the cake for the 5 aspects that needed to be met before we find Atlantis is an advanced civilization, a culture so distinct, so unique, that it could only be the story portrayed by the Egyptians to Solon and then Plato. These were the megalithic builders. This civilization existed 10,000 years ago. It built monuments that are still visible today around the northern hemisphere. We know one of its great structures as one of the great wonders of the world, called Stonehenge. This civilization used boats to take the stones to their locations. They traded around the world. We can see that within the artifacts. They traveled throughout Europe. This was an advanced civilization for its time. And the Greeks would appreciate that because it was very similar in communication skills and building skills to the Greeks. And the Greeks saw themselves as an advanced civilization. And so, Alice, we now know the location of Atlantis. And that is Doggerland, which is now currently under the North Sea. This makes a lot more sense for the location of Atlantis, which is in the northern hemisphere, because the Greeks have this belief system that states that their gods from the north seeded their civilization. And actually, there's lines within Plato's Atlantis that says exactly the same. The Egyptian priests tell Solon that the Atlanteans came down to the Mediterranean and seeded themselves in both the Greek and the Egyptian civilization many years before the pharaohs. They also have this great belief that there was a place called Hyperborea, where, again, based in the northern hemisphere, where the Greek gods lived. This is all this association that the Atlanteans were the children of the gods. We also see this in other tales, such as Troy. This is why the Trojan characters are blue-eyed, blonde, and red-headed. These are not Mediterranean people, these are people from the north. And Atlantis is a tale about a civilization from the northern hemisphere, about a country that was called Atlantis, that was in the Atlantic Ocean, and they're mostly submerged under the North Sea. Well, that's all we got time for you today. I hope you enjoyed the video and our little chat about archaeology. Come to our website where you can find essays and LiDAR investigations. Or come and visit us on YouTube, where we have a video channel where we have more videos for you to browse. So it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from Alice.